This is Mumia Abu-Jamal. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Enjoy.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good to see you, Steve.
Good to see you too, David. And we also have our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, everybody. This show has optimism, success, and surprise. Tune in.
Happy holidays, everybody. And I'm saying happy holidays while I still can before the new administration outlaws that phrase and demands we all say Merry Christmas upon pain of deportation or drone strike. But the little elves here at the Ralph Nader Radio Hour have been busy. We have a jam-packed show for you today. We kick things off with returning guest Professor Adolph Reed, who is going to offer his takeaways on the re-election of Donald Trump. Professor Reed contends that political analysts' reliance on census-designated categories like race have created fake constituencies. People don't generally vote based on their race or ethnicity. They vote based on their actual living conditions. Next up, we'll welcome back Steve Silberstein, a board member of National Popular Vote, a nonprofit that is working to neutralize the Electoral College. Their solution? An interstate compact wherein each state commits its electors to whichever presidential candidate wins the national popular vote. They need enough states to join to equal 270 electoral votes. We'll get an update on their progress. Spoiler, it's getting close. And we'll conclude today's program with a visit from 3 interns from the American Museum of Tort Law. Ralph gave Gabriel Duffany, Dylan Bird, and Rachel Donovan an assignment this summer. Read the dictionary. Their experiences of the dictionary surprise them and may inspire you to take a closer look at your own trusty Websters. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, when it comes to voting, our first guest contends that class trumps race. David?
Adolph Reed is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania and an organizer with the Debs Jones Douglas Institute's Medicare for All South Carolina initiative. His most recent books are The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, and, with Walter Ben Michaels, No Politics But Class Politics. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Adolph Reed.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always good to be back.
Thank you again, Adolph. You wrote a very provocative column on November 11th, 2024, called Going Forward from the Edge of the Abyss, and it appeared on nonsite.org, N-O-N-S-I-T-E, for listeners who want to read the whole article. And the first observation in your article I want you to elaborate relates to a question that I often ask people. Where does Trump get his power? Sure, he's rich. He's pro-Wall Street, so he doesn't have opposition from the business community. But where does he get his power to go to the extremes of rhetoric and record during his first term that he reached? And so I want to ask you to comment on a sentence in your article, and I'll quote it. Trump has no new coalition. He can't, because those groups aren't real as groups. And people identify with them largely around thin identities, more like consumer taste communities or partisan fans of sports teams, period, end quote. Can you elaborate that?
Sure. I mean, I've been noticing for a while now, I'd say at least a decade, if not more, since I came across a term of art in pro wrestling, kayfabe, K-A-Y-F-A-B-E, which is the phenomenon. It's kind of a sort of inverted populist version of Brechtian theater in the sense that it's the phenomenon about pro wrestling that makes it work, because it basically refers to a contrivance on the parts of everyone participating in the wrestling event, audience, performers, managers, ringmasters, such that while everyone knows that it's fake and staged, the contrivance is that everyone nonetheless pretends to accept that it's real, or accepts that it's real for the moment. And in that sense, it depends on something that's not quite suspension of disbelief, but it's more active collusion in believing the untrue. I think demagogues have made use of that technique for some time, and Trump is kind of a master of it. And I think it expresses also another stage in the blending of news and politics and a reality TV performance art. But I'm going back, Ralph, I know you remember when Jeroen Arledge, who was the sports programming director at ABC, I think in the late 70s, was tasked with taking over the news division to make it more attractive and appealing. And I think the Patty Chayefsky story that became the film Network was a dramatization of that general turn and phenomenon. And the more and more I think about it, the more it struck me that the right, by and large, doesn't yet have as many constituencies or as great a general constituency as they would like for us to think that can actually be mobilized to perform public acts, right, or to make their presence felt. But what's even more frightening to me is that our side doesn't have those either, right? Doesn't have those constituencies either. And that what used to be a left increasingly like reminds me of, I used to drive on FDR Drive in New York a lot in the 80s. And when I saw a report that the underneath was hollowed out, so it was just about like I was driving on a hanging garden, right? I mean, that feels like what our understanding of progressive politics is, which is not to say that these made up constituencies, and I think I should say too, what I mean by made up is that they're basically, and I think this is an effect of the rise of pollsters in both political parties, really. But what these nominal constituencies or voting blocks are is basically census categories that pollsters and party operatives make up just those stories around.
In your article, you really threw down a challenge here, which I want to quote to our listeners so you can elaborate on it. Post-election, here's what you said, quote, "We have to face up to the fact, finally, that all we can expect from the Democrats' success is kicking the can of confrontation with fascism down the road for 4 years. But for that approach to make sense, someone, and only the labor left can lead it or maybe even do it, has to spend another 4 years between elections organizing a real constituency for a different way of talking and thinking about and doing politics. To put it bluntly, we won't be able to face up to the fascist juggernaut without working to build an actual popular constituency for a different, openly working class-based politics," end quote. I want to repeat, working class-based politics, end quote. How does that translate into an operating agenda day after day?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One, I hope you guys don't mind a kind of shameless plug for the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, but one of the things that we do is worker training and a political education. And I think one of the most important tasks for us, and for anybody to be engaged in, is a project of pushing back against what's become common sense, right, in the last half century or however long we want to count, neoliberal dominance. I mean, for instance, Ralph, one of the things that struck me especially is during the pandemic, it was sort of striking to see how much full-blown animus toward government or toward the idea of public and public goods that there is out there in society at large. And we know, I mean, Heritage and the rest of the reactionaries, the Koch brothers, have been fueling that and stoking that kind of resentment for as long as they've been around, frankly, right? You can start it with Goldwater or you can start it before Goldwater. But what's different is that since the Clinton years, the Democrats have been just as likely to attack the idea of government or public goods and public services, right? I mean, and they're more likely to do it backhandedly. I mean, my son comment back in the Clinton presidency even was that the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans was the Republicans would lay out a horrible agenda and the Democrats' comment would be, well, us too, but not quite so much. So there hasn't been any space, right, for people to connect even the fact that they like to go to the public library or like to use the public park with this bipartisan full bore attack on the idea of government. And that has gone so far and so deeply within the society. I mean, in addition to doing whatever work we have to do to try to confront the immediate challenges, we need to concentrate on doing sort of popular political education that alters the terms of political debate. Right. And if we can't, I just read an article that'll be coming out soon in Socialist Register by a really smart German fellow named Ingar Solti. It's on the rise of the Alliance for Deutschland in Germany, and more broadly, the rise of what we can probably safely describe now as a fascist authoritarian international, right? And especially with Trump's victory. But one of the striking points that Solti makes, and it struck me especially because I know it from my own life, because I've had a lot of versions of this experience. But he makes the point that any left tendency has to, by its very nature, proceed from an egalitarian sense of human possibility and the ways that society ought to be structured. And he makes the point that things have gone so far in the opposite direction now that proposals that proceed from that egalitarian sensibility automatically get dismissed as naive or pie in the sky by the people who would benefit most from them and whom we need to address. And I think that's another problem with our politics that can't be overcome by focusing only on trying to figure out how to elect the next year's crop of sorry Democrats, is that in addition to doing whatever of that we have to do to keep the wolf away from the door, we've got to figure out ways to engage with people directly around issues that affect their own lives. So one tactic, which can be a strategy that our side has pursued with I think amazing success, has been like, instead of running individual candidates for that competition that always comes down to I like Fords and you like Chevys, is to work around ballot initiatives like the millionaires tax that passed in Massachusetts a couple of years ago, and the efforts to increase the minimum wage and to improve labor rights and protect women's reproductive rights. And many of these initiatives have won in states in which at the same time the Republicans swept all the important offices. So it's in our interest to try to bring the politics down to what actually connects with people's lives on a daily basis. And as we've been saying, Ralph, since we were trying to do the Labor Party thing in the 90s, what's the most broadly shared experience in this country? It's the experience of having to or being expected to work for a living. And that's a material basis that unites the vast majority of us.
We've had programs in the past on the underutilization of local and state referendum rights.
Right.
People can vote as if they're direct democracies, if their own legislature. And there are a lot of towns, cities, and maybe half the states have this initiative referendum recall in their constitution.
Right.
And those, you suggest, should be utilized more directly, because whenever there's a referendum in southern states like Florida and Arkansas on minimum wage, it wins handily.
Right, that's
when
right.
the people voted in. Now, talking about the electoral arena right now, what do you think of the Sanders constituency? He is still the most popular elected politician in America, according to the polls, and he was nearing a victory for the Democratic nomination for president in 2016 before Hillary Clinton's Democratic Party sabotaged him in Nevada primary and elsewhere. And he was heading for a victory in 2020 before his opponents ganged up on him and selected Joe Biden after the South Carolina primary. Is that a constituency that can be mobilized into becoming a real movement? And is Bernie able to do that?
I mean, that's a great question. And I got to say, I don't know, but if it were possible, Bernie would be the only conceivable person around to do it in that way. The thing is, I mean, Bernie's great gift, and this kind of really frustrated me after both 2016 and 2020, when the smart progressives started going into parsing why Bernie lost and what he might have done to win. Bernie was never going to win, right? And I say that from the standpoint with the moral force of having worked my butt off in both campaigns. But I knew the deck was always stacked very much against him. But what Bernie's genius was, I thought, and is like showing the way forward, showing the kind of issue base and the kind of organizing that we need to do to build a movement that could actually challenge for power, right? I mean,
small, high volume contributions.
Right. Well, yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. But the thing is, right, I mean, look, in early 2021, after Biden's inauguration, the Congressional Progressive Caucus had its finest moment, right? And they were great. I mean, it was really impressive to see how they'd mastered playing the inside the Beltway game. But when it came time to go outside the Beltway and to mobilize the constituencies that one depends on, and in Manchin's case and Sinema's case, that was corporations, it became clear that the Progressive Caucus doesn't have that kind of base back home. They have an electoral base. Now, I admit, Ralph, I've had a fantasy in my head since AFL-CIO wouldn't do it for Patco of like 500,000 people shutting down the 14th Street Bridge in D.C., right? But our side doesn't have that kind of political capacity. And in recent weeks, I've become more and more impressed, and not in a good way, with the extent to which the NGOization of our movements has hollowed them out. And there's nothing there, right? And they don't have the capacity to mobilize. It's less true of the labor movement than it is of the others, but it's more true of the labor movement than we need for it to be.
One of the most
Sure.
discouraging aspects of what you're talking about is the Congressional Black Caucus, which has been corporatized for years and
Right.
which was exposed recently in the Capitol Citizen newspaper that we started for taking about
okay.
$11 million over 10 years from AIPAC, and the Israeli government can do no wrong lobby
Right,
in this
right,
country. And for
right.
$11 million to a majority of the Black Caucus, they shut them up on the issue of Palestine and Middle East policy
Right.
by the U.S. government.
That's actually something that I am trying to write about at this very moment, which is, see, the problem is the expectation that the Black Caucus should be something better than it is, right? Like, as you pointed out, the article makes this, but yeah, they've been bought and paid for a long time, but it's not something that they're bought and paid for, right? I mean, that's the politics that they've come up in. And what we think of as Black politics now, and I'll put that in scare quotes always, is really, just an ethnic interest group node in democratic neoliberalism. So what they characterize as the Black agenda, and I mean stuff like, closing the racial wealth gap. There is no such thing as a racial wealth gap because there's no such thing as racial wealth. And as Matt Bruenig points out, 75% of so-called Black wealth is owned by the richest 10% of Black people. 75% of so-called white wealth is owned by the richest 10% of white people. 75% of so-called Hispanic wealth is owned by the richest 10% of Hispanic people. This is like an upper class politics. What we think of as Black politics is an upper class politics. And I can't say that often enough because a lot of us tend to carry around memories from 1962 or 4 or 5. But what we've seen happen in the last 60 years or so since the Voting Rights Act is consolidation of a political class that's responsive only to the Black investor and professional managerial strata. And there's no point looking to form an alliance with the Congressional Black Caucus or with any of the, so-called opinion-shaping elites in, the Black community. So I think that's something else that would be an important step forward for us to kind of shed that sort of expectation and thinking too.
I think there needs to be a ray of sunlight on the doings of the Black Caucus, which I couldn't even get any of the Black chairs of committees years ago to hold a hearing on the economic exploitation of Black Americans in the ghettos in cities around the country. We had to go to Dennis Kucinich's subcommittee to have a hearing. So,
well, that's telling, isn't it?
Yeah, very telling.
Well, Ralph, you remember in 2016 when no less than John Lewis denounced Bernie for Medicare for all and free public higher education, and his objection was that there's nothing free in America, and that Sanders was offering pie in the sky to people and was setting a bad example for young Black people. So now this is John Lewis, the hero of the civil rights movement. So what does that tell you?
Before we close, is there anything else you want to say to our audience?
Well, it's shameless, but I would plug that the audience, take a look at our podcast at the Debs Jones Douglas Institute. It's called classmatterspodcast.org. And we sort of see ourselves as being the place that asks the questions, what would the country look like if it were run by and in the interest of working people? And
That's
thanks
a
again
very
for
good
having me.
scenario, by the way. Well, thank you very much, Adolph. To be continued.
Yep, thanks again for having me. Take care, everyone.
We've been speaking with Adolph Reed. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we're going to find out why both Democratic and Republican state legislatures might be motivated to join the interstate compact known as National Popular Vote. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, December 27, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A Chicago jury last week awarded a $66 million judgment to the family of a 39-year-old mother of four who bled to death following a negligent surgical procedure. The jury returned a $56 million verdict, the highest verdict or settlement against a plastic surgeon in the state of Illinois. With post-judgment interest, the court entered the judgment for $66.26 million. A three-man, nine-woman jury deliberated 3 hours in the case of a Chicago plastic surgeon, Ayub Sayed, and his medical practices that negligently treated Adalia Corcolis, who had come to his clinic in November 2019 for liposuction and what is commonly known as a tummy tuck. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest is going to tell us how we can get presidential campaigns to pay attention to voters outside of so-called battleground states. David?
Steve Silberstein founded and served as the first president of Innovative Interfaces Incorporated, a leading supplier of computer software for the automation of college and city libraries. Mr. Silberstein sold his interest in the company in 2001 and now devotes his time to philanthropic and civic matters, one of which is sitting on the board of directors of National Popular Vote. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Steve Silberstein.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Thank you very much, Steve. For those among our listeners who are not familiar with National Popular Vote, which has been called an agreement among the states to elect the president by national popular vote, could you explain it briefly?
Sure. So according to the U.S. Constitution, each individual state legislature has total power to decide how that votes will be awarded in the Electoral College. There is no requirement in the Constitution that the state give its votes to the winner of that state. In fact, 2 states now don't do that, Nebraska and Maine. They divide their votes. So the National Popular Vote movement is a movement to ask individual states in their legislature to pass a law that says our state will give all its electoral votes, not to the winner of our state, but to the winner of the country. And when a group of states that together have half the votes in the Electoral College, that is 270 Electoral College votes, pass this law, then the person who got the most votes in the country will get the most votes in the Electoral College. So far, 18 states have passed this law. The law is on the books in states from Hawaii to Maine, from New York to California, Illinois, Maryland, Colorado. All these states have passed this law that says our state will give its votes to the winner of the country, not to their individual states. These states have a total of 209 Electoral College votes. Although the law is on the books, it doesn't take effect. That is, it's not implemented until a few more states enact it, so that together we have 270 Electoral College votes, as opposed to the 209 that we have now. About 5 more states for our 270 mark. And we're actively working on that. And we are very confident that we can get these 5 additional states to join the 18 that have already enacted it in time for the 2028 election, assuming.
And what are the 5 states?
Well, it could be any of the 18 states have enacted it. So that means there's 38 who have not enacted it. So it could be any 5 out of that 38. Realistically, we're working in Virginia, we're working in Pennsylvania, we're working in Michigan, we're working in Arizona. We're working wherever there's an opportunity among those 38 to just pick up 5 of them.
And some of them are Republican controlled, and one of the houses in these state legislatures has supported the national popular vote, but not the others. So you're halfway there in some of these states, like Arizona, Michigan, as you said, North Carolina, Nevada, Oklahoma, Virginia. So listeners, if you're from those states, go to the website of the National Popular Vote. You'll get a lot of information. If you want to go deep, Steve and his associates have put out a book called Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by national popular vote. It's downloadable for free, and questions are answered. at the website www.nationalpopularvote.com. That's one word, nationalpopularvote.com.
Yes, that's right. And if we take Arizona, for example, we have passed the Arizona House several years ago when it was a Republican-controlled body. We've also passed the Oklahoma Senate, which is a Republican-controlled body. So in the past, we get a lot of Republican support, although to be honest, of the states that have passed it, it's mostly been with Democratic votes. Because for a while, there's been a theory that Republicans couldn't win the national popular vote. That's why they opposed it. But now that they have actually won the popular vote this time around, that theory, which caused some of them to oppose it, has gone by the wayside. So we're very optimistic that we'll be able to pick up even more Republicans.
And also, one would think that since the Democrats have won the popular vote, when Gore ran against Bush in 2000 and when Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump in 2016, but lost the election because they lost the Electoral College vote, even though they won the national popular vote.
Yes.
You think they'd be strongly backing your effort? I haven't seen the Democratic National Committee or the Democratic apparatus really put the muscle in recent years behind your effort. Am I missing something?
Well, Democrats have been supportive. It's been quiet, shall we say. Here, it hasn't been as vocal as it could be.
Well, years ago, I believe Donald Trump, even after he was elected or selected by the Electoral College, called it a crazy system. You have any hope that he will come out for electing presidents by national popular vote, since he got a plurality of votes last time around in terms of national popular voters?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. In 2016, after he was elected losing the national popular vote, he said he preferred the national popular vote. He thought the current electoral college system was terrible and that the president should be elected by national popular vote. So he said that even though he, quote, lost it in 2016. He has been quiet on the issue ever since. So maybe he will repeat his statement again. We're hopeful that he does. And if so, of course, all the Republicans will fall in line.
One declaration by Donald Trump in favor of national popular vote for the election of the president could turn the tide and get you well over the finish line. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. Of course, he's got a lot of things on his plate, as we know, many of them not so good. And so we don't know where this will fit in his priority list.
Fortunately, the polls are on your side, correct?
Yes, all the polls show that the overwhelming majority of the people in this country believe that the person who gets the most votes should win. The Electoral College should be reformed or done away with so that happens. That's both Democrats and Republicans and independents, everyone.
Well, listeners, those of you who are very discouraged about citizen action and consider it futile, how about this citizen action by Steve Silberstein and probably less than a dozen full-time staff lobbying state legislature after state legislature?
Yes.
How about that, listeners?
Yes, absolutely. And you'll find state legislators very responsive, certainly a lot more responsive to individual people lobbying them or talking to them or requesting things than the federal legislature. The Congress, as you know, is a lot of gridlock. It's very hard to reach these people. But state legislators are easy to reach. I'd love to talk to constituents, and you can get a lot more movement, if you will, out of a state legislature than you can out of the federal government.
You've done all this in about 10 years with how many full-time staff, Steve?
Yeah, we have about 6 full-time staff people.
There you are, listeners. This isn't being done by PAC money. It isn't being done by huge TV ads. It's being done by reasonable, prudent, in-person interactions with state legislators one at a time. So there you are.
But the most important thing of this is, besides the person getting the most votes winning, is that every state is involved. And what's really, really wrong about the present system is the whole election is in a couple of states. They get all the presidential pork, all the presidential attention, and all the rest of us, 80% of the country, is totally ignored and irrelevant.
And by the way, it shrivels the two-party competition down to one-party states. As Ben Barnes of Texas told me once, a political observer of some repute, he said when the Democrats stopped campaigning for the presidency because they gave up on Texas, it shredded the Democratic Party all the way down to elect a dog catcher in towns and cities throughout Texas. So it destroys any kind of even two-party competitive system, further making your point.
Yes, exactly.
Any comments or questions by Steve, David, Hannah, before we conclude?
Just to play devil's advocate, but I kind of mean this. Isn't there an elegance to the Electoral College in that states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan are metaphors for the electorate? That there's a reason they're swing states, and it's good to focus on those three states the same way we ask Iowa and New Hampshire to vet our candidates first in the primary season or the caucus season?
No, there's no reason for it. Those states didn't even exist when the Constitution, was established. It's just purely an accident. And there's, as Ralph pointed out, there's less and less of these battleground states year by year. Those states are not typical of the United States. Each state is unique in some way. So, Wisconsin has a big dairy industry. Pennsylvania has coal mining or fracking or something like that. So the candidates just concentrate on those, what are really very obscure issues to most of the people in the country. These states are not typical. They are not representative in any way, shape, or form of the rest of the country.
Well, on that note, we have to conclude. We've been talking with Steve Silberstein of the National Popular Vote Movement out of San Francisco area. The website, listeners, is nationalpopularvote.com. And if you want to get involved in those states we mentioned that are remaining to get over the 270 Electoral College barrier, you can find out exactly what you need to do. Your questions are answered at that website, and you can download free this massive book called Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by national popular vote. Thank you, Steve Silberstein, for a great civic effort, and it may be concluded by 2028, especially if Donald Trump follows up on his 2016 criticism of the Electoral College and tells his Republican compatriots at the state level to vote the National Popular Vote Compact between the states. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you very much for having me, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Steve Silberstein. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Our next guests are three interns from the American Museum of Tort Law who got a rather unique assignment this summer. Read the dictionary. Let's hear how that went. David?
Dylan Bird is a sophomore at St. Lawrence University pursuing a double major in global studies and Spanish on a pre-law track. Gabriel Duffany is a sophomore at the University of Connecticut pursuing a double major in human rights and communication, also on a pre-law track, and he is an intern at the American Museum of Tort Law. Rachel Donovan is the outreach coordinator at the American Museum of Tort Law, and she is pursuing studies in education. All three recently worked as summer interns at the American Museum of Tort Law in the VoxBox Civic Engagement Summer Course, and they participated in Ralph Nader's Dictionary Pilot. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dylan Bird.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Gabriel Duffany.
Thank you for your time today. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Rachel Donovan.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Listeners, this is an extraordinary special occasion. We're inviting these young people to give their experiences regarding a project that we put before them this last summer when they were interning or working at the American Museum of Tort Law in Winston, Connecticut. And as you know, I've been very critical of the addiction that has been induced by many of these corporations to get everybody staring at screens. And so I thought, since there are a lot of articles written about young people not reading very much anymore, even though they can access all kinds of information on the internet, I thought, well, let's go back to print and let's answer the question, will young people start to read again? And so, apropos what my elder brother Shaft many years ago suggested, start with reading a dictionary. How could anything be more basic? So we gave each of these young people a brand new copy of the Merriam-Webster dictionary in print, all 1,600 plus pages, and they spent between 4 and 6 hours going through it, determining how they were going to benefit most in that amount of time, from leafing through, picking out certain words, thinking about them, going through the alphabet. And so we have them here today to discuss what it meant to them. Like many young people, they spend a lot of time with their iPhone and watching screens. And this time, they had a unique experience, and we want to share it with you, listeners, because there are many, many other young people that may have the same positive, affirmative, exciting experience as these young people had that day last summer at the American Museum of Tort Law. So let's start with you, Dylan Bird. Give us some background, how you received the suggestion, as personal as you can make it, and what you learned from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. It's a very daunting task when somebody hands you a full dictionary over 1,000 pages or so and asks you to read it front to back. Once you start to actually, sink your teeth into it, not read it, maybe straight through, maybe skip to some different letters that you're more interested in, or just look at the journey of language when you're looking through the dictionary. I actually found it to be a very positive experience rather than simply looking up individual words and then ending your journey there. The goal really becomes the exploration of knowledge, and kind of finding the words is the goal after finding the word that maybe you searched for to start. But it was a super interesting project. And in my own overview, I picked out 26 different words, one for each letter of the alphabet, that were either new to me or the definitions were interesting to me. And I just thought it was an interesting project in total for me to experience, considering my exposure to a paper dictionary throughout my childhood was quite limited, to say the least. You'd pull it out for the annual game of Scrabble or maybe for a school project, but to actually sit and go through it, you really show the utility of a paper dictionary.
And tell our listeners, Dylan, how you chose letters from A to Z. Why don't you go through them? That intrigued you.
Absolutely. So I have my list right here. First off, for A, I have agog. Just did not know what that word meant. Awe-stricken. For my second word, beefeater, a guard in the Tower of London. Thought it was quite cool. Coriaceous, which means referring to leather of some kind. Democracy, just because I believe the definition of democracy should be looked at quite a bit, or at least more often. Merriam-Webster actually defined 800-pound gorilla, so I put that down. Firewater, which is another term for liquor. Globalization, because I believe everyone needs to, as a global studies major, I believe globalization needs to be looked at through a more critical lens. So, seeing maybe the problems with the definitions of globalization. Human, I thought this was a very interesting word because when I was a kid, I used to have a teacher who would have us define different words, but she would always say, you can't use the word in the definition or the root of the word in the definition. And every single definition for human has the word human or humanity or something like that in it. I thought it was quite cool. Interlope means to interject. You have jobbery, taking a few odd jobs here and there to make ends meet. Kleptocracy, system of government based on the leader being for their own personal interest at the expense of their constituency. The definition of law, of course, work at a law museum. Man-eater, nocebo. I did not know that that was a word. It's like a placebo, but negative effects instead of just or positive. You have orography, the study of mountains based on geology. Police action, quizzical, rill, which is a type of small river. The definition of school I thought was quite interesting, especially in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. What encapsulates what school is. Is it education? Is it a building? Of course, the word tort. Working at the American Museum of Tort Law, I believe everyone needs to know this definition. So I think it's definitely very important. My U was ugly duckling. Wasn't even sure that that was going to be in the dictionary. I thought it was quite interesting, similar to the 800-pound gorilla. Vesper was my next one. I grew up going to a Catholic middle school and a Catholic high school. So I thought it was interesting to find a prayer that I'd never heard of. So it's an evening prayer. The definition of war is next. Next is xenophile, so opposite of xenophobe, and then youth. And to finish it off, my favorite movie genre, zombie.
Very, very fascinating. It shows how you found a way to integrate your imagination with a quick peruse and choice of words that you want to define. Some of them you knew, of course, and others you didn't know, which is what is great about going through a dictionary. Dylan, before you leave, I just want to quote from your concise statement here where you said about the dictionary, quote, "It is also the most interesting book I will ever have the pleasure of perusing, filled to the brim with literally every English word. I understand now that the dictionary should not be looked at as a mere tool to sit on a shelf, waiting for the annual game of Scrabble school assignment. It should, however, be treated as a true entity of exploration." End quote. I like that word, exploration. So thank you very much, Dylan. Let's go to Gabriel next.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've worked at the museum almost 2 years now. It's been a long time. And I'm coming from a journalistic background. I'm a staff writer at the campus newspaper here where I go to school at UConn. So this assignment, I would say, it was, as you said, Dylan, it was a little daunting at first. It's a full 1,600 pages or give or take. And, that's a lot. And I will say, just off the bat, you're not going to remember every word. You're going to go through and some will stick out. And certainly some, like Dylan, you mentioned, a lot of them did stick out. But for me, what really did stand out, it wasn't the individual words. It was more so the process of defining that I found the most compelling. So it showed out to me, like in a linguistic sense, that these aren't exact definitions here. They're more so measurements, gauges of people's public opinions and definitions that would shift over time. So it was interesting to see how the evolution of words came, how meanings evolved over time with new technologies, new cultural moments. And as a news writer, I found that fascinating. The complexities of a word, the connotations that go with it, they can make or break the framing of any certain topic. If you write a headline that gives a piece negative connotations, use negative words, that will frame your subject matter in a way that makes readers think of that in a negative light. So I think really the linguistic evolution behind the dictionary, how these words come to be and which ones gain popularity and which ones fall to the wayside. I think that seeing that trend really brought to mind the complexities of defining words and again linguistically culturally which words gain prominence and again as a news writer I come back to that idea that your biases shine through whether you intend to or not and obviously the role is to be objective as possible but even the slightest change in a word will give your readers a different idea of what you're speaking to and I think politically this is quite heightened at the moment after fairness doctrine what so have you can basically play to any side whether you like it or not necessarily stating your position, but by using the words that carefully craft a message, leading, nudging a reader into one direction or the other. So I found that aspect of it really compelling. And to see the evolution of words, again, tracking their trend, which ones were popular, which ones were no longer popular. Rachel's going to speak to that in a moment about the different meanings that words can take on colloquially in modern times as well. So I think just finding which ones my generation personally uses more than previous generations and to what effect that those have. I think that linguistically on that level would just that definitions aren't necessarily one set thing set in stone, but they actually evolve and change over time. I think that was the part that I gained the most through reading it front to end. That was really a compelling assignment and I'm grateful for that experience.
Well, thank you, Gabe. And this is a good segue to Rachel Donovan's take on this, which is a little different. Rachel?
Thank you. Before partaking in this project, I thought that looking everything up online was equivalent to a physical dictionary. I believed a lot more that I saw on social media for definitions rather than what the true definition was. I wrote my paper on the age of social media and how traditional words now take on new meanings. Newer generations have the power to rework a definition into something completely different than what was traditionally put into the dictionary, which has also resulted in the original word being redefined. The word brat, for example, I wrote about because that word is typically looked upon in a negative light, and the dictionary describes it as an ill-mannered, annoying child. But newer generations have taken the word and used the word brat to connect with others, and they've made it very empowering. During the Harris Walz campaign, they used the word brat to connect with younger generations, And I do believe the use of the word made the campaign more relatable to younger people, which showed me that language and words really do have an impact and that generations can change what was once a typical word into something very different. I think that this project could be very important for students of all ages because it's not often that you would use a physical dictionary very much anymore versus just going online and looking up a word, and now multiple definitions could come up. You may not even find exactly what you're looking for because words undergo new meanings on a near daily basis. And I think having the chance to read the original definition may give students new meanings to words that they may thought they had the knowledge of due to social media.
Thank you, Rachel. You know, words basically are containers of thoughts, and people who have a wide vocabulary are more likely to have a wider range of thoughts. And people who just have a very minimum vocabulary and overuse things like you know and sort of and kind of, they tend to restrict their intellectual development because they're not using the words that extend their mind. Now, listeners, this was all a one-day project. They did this all in one day or so. So are you going back to your dictionary in print from time to time and leafing through it? Or have you gone back to mostly watching screens?
It's actually on my desk near my bed. And every once in a while, I'll take a look through it. And even when I'm writing essays, sometimes instead of just going on dictionary.com on the other tab, I'll flip through the book. It was such an interesting experience, and it really resonated with me. So I think having the dictionary near me and kind of flipping through it every once in a while, it's a good way to like remember the experience and like almost the epiphany that I had when reading this and doing the project for the first time.
Gabe?
Yeah, I'd have to completely agree with Dylan there. I will admit, of course, that the convenience of looking up a word in the moment, it fulfills the task, of finding the definition. But I have found myself going back, not necessarily to look up one specific meaning of a word for an essay urgently. I feel the fast-pacedness of modern day is often the reason why people look to these newer technologies. But in my leisure, I'd say I've returned to the dictionary just to remember some of the words that I fondly kind of forgotten at this point, and also just to recount the experience that I had initially at the museum with this, because it was quite a good experience, I would say. And through under your guidance, Mr. Nader, I find myself looking at the dictionary almost in a sentimental light. So I have kind of an emotional connection to it.
That's very interesting. Rachel?
I have the dictionary in the office with me at work, and I do turn to it when writing emails for outreach, or if I need to find a word to help improve anything I'm writing, or if someone sends an email and I may be unaware of what the words they're using mean, then I can turn to the dictionary for that as well.
You know, Merriam-Webster puts out a synonym dictionary of synonyms, which is even more useful perhaps in some of your coursework at college or university. What do your friends say when you talk about this experience? Do they think it's strange, or are they curious enough to try it themselves, pick up your dictionary?
Well, to use one of the words that I learned from my list, most of my friends are very agog when they hear that this was an assignment that I had to do over the summer. You know, many times when I'll tell my friends, I'll get the usual, "What? You had to read a full dictionary, like cover to cover?" That's kind of crazy. But then when I, tell them about the experience, tell them about, what I read through, maybe even like show them my little report, they're always like, well, that's actually a little more interesting than I first thought it was going to be. I think like just the mere idea of reading through a dictionary is enough to stop people from doing it, just because it's such like an information dense and rich book. But once you start to, like I said before, so once you start to sink your teeth into it, you start to get lost finding the different words, the different connections, and it's just an interesting book to read in general. And I think I've passed that to a few of my friends. I'm not sure if they've gone out and bought a paper dictionary to do it themselves yet, but I'll make sure to encourage it, definitely, because I do truly believe that this was a positive experience to do for most young people.
And Rachel, your friends?
Agreeing with Dylan, I did have a few of my friends read over my paper before I explained to them what I had to do. I think approaching my friends and saying that I had to read a whole dictionary does come across scary, especially when I probably couldn't tell you the last time my friends personally have touched a dictionary. But I think after reading the paper and thinking hard about that there's so much information that can be taken from it, they may have a new outlook on it.
Well, I'm very pleased that you let us open up some horizons for you from our years of experience. When I was a teenager, I actually accepted my brother's recommendation and I read the dictionary over time, page by page. It was like a tremblingly exciting exploration. To this day, I can almost feel the trembling excitement. Of course, I spent many, many hours doing that over a period of weeks. But on the other hand, you've taught us something very extraordinary, listeners. We deal with law students and graduate students, and the quality of their statements and the quality of the writing was very, very impressive. And it goes to what my sister Claire has said repeatedly in the context of her book, You Are Your Own Best Teacher, tapping into the curiosity and imagination of tweens. You can go to inspiringtweens.com for more detail. But she said once, if you have low expectations of students, they will oblige you. You have high expectations of students, they will excite you. David?
Word origins often tell us that language evolves. So how important is it, do you think, to police words to make sure that their definitions don't change? Or do you give words breathing room and allow them to evolve?
No, I would say policing words in that sense is almost an impossible task. You can try and dictate what something is going to mean or what it should mean under your definition of that. But I think it's almost a slippery slope to assign what a word should mean or should not mean. I think in relation to, of course, the government, people have that sort of fear that, words and speech being controlled is one of the first things. It's the First Amendment, right? So it's the most important thing in many people's eyes that we have protected as rights as citizens. So I think policing speech, particularly in America, as we see, of course, through the First Amendment, this is one of our fundamental guiding principles, is an impossible task and maybe shouldn't be strived for in the sense that it's going to promote or really stifle certain types of speech, and it's going to stifle maybe oppositional speech, right? It's going to stifle speech that people aren't comfortable hearing, or maybe that dissent towards the mainstream opinions of whether that be the government, whether that be the media. But I think it's crucially, critically important, and I think many would agree that those oppositional perspectives, those oppositional definitions really are fundamental to having a free and open discourse as a society. So I think policing speech is an impossible task and maybe one that should not be strived for in the end.
That's well said. Hannah?
I'm curious about your experience going from a more, you could say, democratized source of definitions, looking stuff up online and getting all sorts of different ways of describing things, to a book that is finite, that has, there's a set of people who are supposed to know what they're talking about, giving you definitions. I'm curious what your experience has been. It seems kind of like a reverse of how a lot of previous generations have gotten their information.
I would say in my essay response, I noted there were certain limitations to the full complex meanings of speech, right? So it only has one flat definition, maybe an example sentence or two. But you're absolutely correct when you say that this is the opinion of one corporation, one entity that is giving these definitions out, albeit through the perspectives of, scholarly research, et cetera, a variety and breadth of sources. But I think although the dictionary, yes, in itself, it has its limitations, it's the entryway, it's the gateway to understanding the fuller meanings and the social and cultural meanings that certain words take on as they're used in different contexts. So I would grant that you are absolutely correct when you say that there is specific limitations to reading one source, one Merriam-Webster dictionary, whatever that might be. It differs from dictionary company to dictionary company even. But it really is just the gateway. It doesn't end there. Once you close the final page, you kind of have to understand different contexts, of course. And I think one of the most fascinating things to me, especially as a news writer, was seeing these words that I had just learned, some of them for the first time, in different lights, being used to explain different circumstances, fictitious and non-fictitious, because I think literary definitions really, they show a lot about the underlying attitudes and beliefs of a culture and of different, authors.
Rachel, as an educator, I'd be really interested in your perspective as well, as a source of information, what your thoughts are.
I think using the actual paper dictionary helps with critical thinking skills for students rather than having to not really put much effort into looking things up. And there's may just be one definition set in the paper dictionary, But with all the definitions you can find online, there's ways that can get very confusing as well for the students. They may confuse one definition with another and then mix them up and create something that's very far off from what the actual definition is supposed to be.
Before we conclude, I want to hail the guidance of Melissa Bird for this project's Executive Director of the American Museum for Tort Law. And the full statements by the students will be on the museum website. And anybody who wants more information about developing a project like this in their own community or school or neighborhood should contact Melissa Bird through tortmuseum.org or 860-379-0505. Thank you very much, Rachel, Gabe, and Dylan.
Thank you for your time today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for having me on today. I really enjoyed my time. I really enjoyed the dictionary project as well, and I highly recommend, if you're listening to this, to go out and buy a dictionary, leaf through it in your own time. Thank you all.
And thank you, Dylan. As they say, spread the word, right?
Absolutely.
I want to thank our guests again, Adolph Reed, Steve Silberstein, Dylan Bird, Gabriel Duffany, and Rachel Donovan. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of The Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Well, didn't you hear how a few people can make a big difference? That's what usually spells justice in American history.
Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, you should. Step up. Step up. I think that you should step